Welcome to Doctors at Work. My name's Matt Daniel, and this podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. Today's topic is mental imagery in surgery. Now, learning practical skills such as surgery or something else is challenging. And in this episode of Doctors at Work, Brian Westerberg tells me about mental imagery. This is a technique that he himself found through his contacts in the elite sport world. It's a technique that helps him anticipate and practice surgical steps and is also a way to train new surgeons as well. Welcome, Brian. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Matt. I'm an ear surgeon in Vancouver, Canada. Did my training in Canada, partly at Queen's University, and then moved to Vancouver several years ago, where I finished my training here. I've been fortunate over the years to have worked in an office with some very high-end professional athletes who subsequently became surgeons. So developed an interest in the mental imagery and how your mind impacts your daily function.
I'm really interested in exploring that topic today. And for me, there's quite a lot of overlap between that sort of performance psychology as it applies to sport and that same performance psychology as it applies to us as doctors, whether that's in medicine or surgery, whatever we do. And I'm interested in maybe let's kind of start broad. What do you think is the relationship between high performance sport and high performance medicine?
I think there's quite a bit of similarity. If you look at elite athletes, they train most of their lives to do a very specific technical task. They're often very driven people, hence the reason that they reach that elite level. Not unlike surgeons, I think surgeons by and large will focus their technical skills in a very specific area such that they become very good at doing what they do. Also, usually very driven people. Both spend many of their waking hours either thinking about or practicing their profession and trying to get better at it. I think there's a lot of overlap between elite athletes and elite surgeons.
And your surgical expertise, it's not just otorhinolaryngology in general, it's ear surgery specifically. So you've clearly focused down to a quite narrow area of expertise.
Yeah, very much so. I grew up in a small town. I always thought I would go back to a small town, and every decision I made took me further away from that small town. And now I operate on 1 cubic centimeter of the human body. So you kind of need a bigger city to support that profession.
Okay, so you talked about mental imagery. So can you tell me how did you discover this concept of mental imagery? How did you first come across it?
Yeah, so to be clear, I am not an elite athlete. I started off doing random neurocycling mainly as a means of getting out of the office. I mean, I'm sure your day is like mine. The inbox is always full, and I found that no matter how hard I worked, there was always more to do. So I needed something that pushed me away from the office. And the random neurocycling, it was a commitment to do a couple of long distance rides during the week, and then both weekend days you were out for long rides. And then so that's the closest I've come to any elite sport. I was cycling one day in Mallorca with some friends. We were there for a week of cycling, and I don't know if you've ever ridden there. There's a ride down to Sa Calabra. It's about 11-kilometer descent. And it's just beautiful. It's like a switchback road going down, and it was a beautiful sunny day early in the week when we went down to Sa Calabra, but the only way out of Sa Calabra is back up that 11 kilometers ascent. So and when we did it early in the week, it was a glorious day. Towards the end of the week, the two guys I was with, they wanted to do it again. They're both lighter, stronger on the bike than I am. I was tired both physically and mentally by the week, and was threatening a bit of rain. And I figured, I'm going to ride down there with these guys. We're going to turn around at the bottom. They're going to drop me. I'm going to be riding up in the rain by myself, and I wasn't keen on it. But they were keen on it. And so we went, hit the bottom, turned around, and of course they dropped me. and I'm riding by myself. And on your bike, you have everything. I've got my heart rate, I've got my power output, and I'm watching them both drop. My heart rate's dropping, my power output is dropping. It's raining, I'm miserable. And I just stopped and I thought, I'm cycling in Mallorca, for crying out loud. And just that mind shift suddenly put everything into perspective, and my power output starts to climb, my heart rate climbs, and I almost caught the guys. And it was really a good example of how your mind is both your biggest ally and also your biggest enemy, and how you control, how you react to any given situation defines how that situation evolves, whether it's on the bike or arguably in the operating room. If you go in thinking about all the obstacles that are between you and the end of the operation, you can easily get bogged down on that. Whereas if you just come into the surgery envisioning that success at the end, it's amazing how much better at least things subjectively seem to go. And arguably, I would say objectively as well.
What's the balance? I mean, I can see the benefit in being concerned about what might go wrong, anticipating challenges, anticipating problems, and being ready to overcome them. So I can see that there's a benefit to that, as well as a benefit to visualizing the perfect outcome. But if you just visualize the perfect outcome, is there not a danger that you won't prepare for what might go wrong?
Yeah, I think so. And people talk about the imposter syndrome, how you don't believe you are the appropriate person to be doing that surgery, for instance. But I think the imposter syndrome is good in some respects because it makes you more aware of those possibilities. But at the same time, you have to have that at least the level of confidence to believe in yourself that you can get to that end line. Right. And it's a fine line. The people who I worry about the most in the operating room are those who just have such deep confidence that they don't think that anything could ever go wrong. And I like it when people admit that they have that imposter syndrome. And it's also, I think, a motivation to do better, right? Like if you believe you reach the pinnacle and there's no further room for improvement, well, you're never going to improve. So it's important to have that imposter syndrome, I think, to some degree, to believe that you can do better, no matter how good you are at any level.
So it sounds like there's a balance to be had because on one hand you have somebody who just thinks of the positive, who believes that everything will go smoothly, and you and I and every other physician slash surgeon will know that sometimes bad stuff just happens. Yeah. So no matter how good you are, sometimes bad stuff just happens. So it's not good to just believe that everything's perfect, but equally, if you focused on all the obstacles and worrying about every single thing, and you don't have the confidence that you can do it, maybe in the way that you didn't have the confidence that you could climb back up. So if you don't have that confidence that you can climb back up, that's also a problem.
Yeah, no, very much so. And you also touched on, how bad things happen to good people and how do you deal with that? And I think that's another lesson that we can take from sport, right? One of the reasons I gravitated to ear surgery is because by and large, I operate on young, healthy people. Usually they go home the same day. Usually I make them better, and rarely does anybody suffer anything ill toward or die. And I came to realize early on that I was not somebody who dealt well with those adverse outcomes. So I gravitated to a profession where I don't get those very often. But, in sport, like if you have several events during a day and you totally screw up the first one, how do you park that? How do you push that aside to focus then on the next one? So, if you're in the operating room and the first case doesn't go so well, like how do you park that? How do you deal with that to push it out of the foreground so that you can then focus on the next two procedures that you have to do a good job on? And I think there's lessons in sport too that we can take and apply to surgery to help with in that respect as well.
So how do people in sport deal with that, or how do you or how would you deal with something like that?
Well, admittedly, I don't deal with it well still, but There's a sports psychologist, Jason Brooks, in Winnipeg, who would be also a great person for one of your podcasts, Matt. So we've worked with him on several educational days where we've talked about those kinds of things. People use mindfulness. I tried mindfulness, but I can't really say that it worked well for me, other than to recognize that the time on the bike, I often find mindful in many respects. Yeah. You're cycling up a mountain and you just get into that, people talk about a flow state too, where time just passes and you have no perception of the time and you accomplish things that you can never accomplish. And I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but when you get into that climbing state where I just get a mental clarity where I can just see things that I had a difficult time seeing before. And I think a lot of professional cyclists actually have ADD, where they just found that when they exercise, they just got that clarity of thinking and they didn't need medications in order to focus. And I think there's a real benefit to that. So I think, mindfulness, some people will find. And one of the things they talk about, putting it on a leaf and letting it float away. So I tried that. I think probably one of the biggest things that I've had is I've had some great people that I've worked with who I've respected, who I can just bare my soul to. I'd call them up and say, "Oh, you wouldn't believe the stupid thing I did today," and I would just tell them and explain why I thought it was stupid. And they often the response is, "Oh, don't worry about it. I did that last month. It all worked out fine." And having that person that you can just talk to in a non-judgmental way. And in many respects, I think athletes use their coaches for that. Like the woman I worked with for the longest time, Jane Lee, she was a professional soccer player, and her soccer coach at the time became really her life coach throughout her career. And having that person who you just know is there when you need them, I think is key in our profession. Our profession is really hard on people. And I think you really need to have that support.
I hope you're enjoying the show. Please click subscribe so you'll be notified when new episodes become available. This podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. You can be part of that mission too by forwarding this show to one person who you think might benefit from listening. Thank you. Now on with the show. I think they're great things. I certainly would very much echo that idea of support, and it's something that I've come to, in my life, maybe, I don't know, over the last 5 years or so, not before, but sort of just that recognition that, things are difficult and that I need and will continue to need to have access to sources of support that will help my own career longevity in whichever, however it turns up. But I actually particularly like exercise, because exercise for me is likewise sort of the same thing that you go out there, whatever it is, sort of, whether it's cycling or running or even just a walk, it's, that kind of that physical activity being outside is like the mind just clears. So it doesn't, and all of a sudden things make sense that didn't before.
Yeah, and I'm fortunate. I live in British Columbia. We have just miles and miles and miles of nobody but
Yeah.
forest. And in fact, I'm supposed to write prescriptions now for people to walk in the woods because of the phytochemicals. They make you happier and stuff. But
Can I have one of those prescriptions, Brian? Does it include
sure, no
flights?
problem.
Does it include flights? I'm interested. Sort of, let's kind of go back to mental imagery. I mean, what is mental imagery?
So mental imagery is just envisioning an activity without any overt movement, and just rehearsing it over and over in your mind. So there's mental imagery, mental practice. Mental practice is repetitive, active mental imagery, if you will. So, generally I just use mental imagery to be all inclusive in that respect. And we looked at, there's a number of different ways of doing it. So early in your career as an athlete, and arguably, I think, as a surgeon too, you will first use like a third person imagery where you're envisioning how somebody else is doing it. But as you get better at your profession, and the technical skills involved, you'll start to use the internal process or the first person narrative where you are envisioning yourself doing it. And I think that's really when mental imagery becomes powerful, when you have a good understanding of the technical task and the timing of the technical task, particularly in athletics, and you can rehearse in your mind over and over again doing that task. And if as a basketball player you envision doing a free throw 100 times, it's like you have done it 100 times. And they've shown in sport too the benefit of that. The benefit of studying mental imagery in sport, of course, is that the task is defined, the success is defined, and the winner is defined. The person who crosses the finish line the first is obviously doing the most successful. Surgery, arguably, it's harder to measure the outcomes and the task too, to define the task. So, I think looking at sport and what works in sport and elite athletes, I think there's lessons that we can find there that we can then take and look at in surgery to see how we can best use mental imagery in surgical care.
I'm interested. Let's imagine that you have a brand new resident that started working with you, somebody right at the beginning of their career. How would you use these kind of principles to help them learn surgery?
Yeah, and we can step back a little bit. People, well, Malcolm Gladwell talked about the 10,000 hours to make an expert. And in some respects, he misquoted the data. It's not 10,000 hours, it's 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. You really have to focus your training and look at it critically, which includes planning what you're going to do, doing it, and then reflecting on the act of it. So we try and take that lesson to training too. So the trainee, the day before the surgery, will review the list that we're going to be doing. They'll send me an email the night before saying, okay, this is what I think we're going to be doing. I would like to focus on these aspects. And they're very specific. So it's not just doing mastoidectomy. I really want to focus on the cortical mastoidectomy. I really want to focus on these aspects of the surgery. And the next day we really focus on that. And then afterwards they send me a follow-up email saying, yeah, this is what we did. This is what I think I did well. This is what I didn't do well. I need to focus on this the next time. And then the next time we're doing that procedure, he incorporates that into his pre-op objectives too, to try and focus on those aspects. So that's the bigger picture. And I think it really helps the resident when they're envisioning what they want to focus on, of course, is to, review surgical videos of those steps and then rehearse in their mind, looking at the CT scan, looking at the anatomy that they expect to encounter and how they're going to encounter each of those steps along the way. And I think it's, every surgical procedure you can divide up into steps, just as athletes, I'm sure, if they're running a 100-meter sprint, they are dividing it up into certain segments of that race, and to have specific objectives for each one of those steps, I think really works well in terms of focusing the training.
So that's really, really powerful, that idea of breaking it up into steps, because the danger otherwise, when people are learning surgery, you always start at the beginning and you do the beginning of the procedure time and time and time again. But you only do the end or the middle bits much fewer times because you run out of time or whatever. So you never actually, what you really want to practice is, or maybe a more advanced trainee, they want to practice the bit at the end or the bit in the middle, not keep doing the bit in the beginning. And it's probably better if the experienced surgeon does the bit in the beginning, because they'll be much quicker, and then that creates the time for them to focus on the specific bit that they actually want to focus on.
Yeah, very much so. And then the idea of parsing things into segments, I think is really important. In the random neurocycling, you 1,200 kilometers, that's a bloody long ways to ride. riding 100 kilometers 12 times, that's much more easily doable. And I think, if you're coming into an operation and all you're worried about is getting to the end, it becomes much more challenging, I think, than just saying, okay, I'm just going to get the skin incision done. Check, it's done. I'm going to do this, that, check, it's done. And you get that, it's like your to-do list that you just get to stroke things off of. It's always much nicer to do a to-do list on a piece of paper where you see the line through it rather than on your computer where you just delete it and then you don't see that it's done. So it's nice having that mental checklist, I think, as well.
Yeah, yeah. Now let's kind of think in practical terms. Let's say if you're doing this for yourself, how do you make it happen? What do you actually do?
And it's interesting. Even before I knew what mental imagery was, I think I was doing it. I'm sure you do it as well. Like when you're first starting out, you'd be worried about your sleep the next day, and I'd be looking at the CT scans, and I would just close my eyes, and I was trying to visualize the anatomy and what I was going to encounter, and thinking through, okay, if this pops up, how am I going to deal with that? And then, if that doesn't work out, how can I fall back on and stuff? So I would rehearse in my mind beforehand, just trying to envision what I was going to encounter. Um, and then naturally just found that evolved into a more sophisticated process, obviously, too, as you became, the more often you did, in my case, a mastoidectomy, the more often you understood what could happen, and how to deal with it too. So, and then, in my profession too, like I just do ear surgery, but when I'm on call, I have to deal with airway emergencies, and it's as I do less and less in the neck, and it's been longer and longer since I did it. Those airway emergencies become more and more intimidating. So, we've started up in our hospital just through, the rehearsal of those procedures in the operating rooms, in the operating theaters, and just creating this real life scenario as much as possible with a mannequin on the operating room bed in the actual operating room that we're going to be using with the actual equipment we're going to be using. And there's somebody who is moderating the session saying, okay, this has happened. Now what are you going to do? And repeating that in your mind and rehearsing that as to how you're going to deal with those emergencies when they arise. And then when they arise, it's like you just did it yesterday, right?
And it sounds like you've got the simulation, with you playing yourself and mannequins and scenarios, and then you've got the you sat in your office looking at the scans, thinking about the scans, and all of that kind of that's converting surgery from something we do with our hands into something that very much happens in the brain rather than the hands, or the brain as well as the hands.
Yeah, and like in with mental imagery in sport, when you look at it, there's open activities, and then there's more closed activities. The open activity would just be, a football match where you don't ever know where the ball is going to go or what's going to happen. You can't predict. Other people are defining the temporal activity, if you will. Whereas within football, there's a penalty shot, right? So that's a very closed activity, where it is the timing of it, the temporal representation is controlled by the person taking the penalty shot. So that mental rehearsal of a penalty shot works much better than a mental rehearsal in an open activity where you really can't control some of the other factors. And in the operating room, you can take that to your advantage, right? Like we talked about the different steps, and although you may say the disease is often hard to predict, it's very open. In many respects, the procedures that we do, particularly in the ear, are very close. Like the steps are very defined, and the anatomy is fairly predictable in the ear. So you can really convert an open procedure into a very closed activity.
Okay. I wonder if I could bring us to a close, and perhaps if I could ask you to summarize what would be your top tips for doctors at work when it comes to mental imagery.
And obviously a very broad question. I can tell you the things that have really helped me along the way. And like the colleagues that I have worked with who have been professional athletes in a former career are invaluable sounding boards for when you get into trouble. Um, just to listen so that you can talk to people, but also they bring lessons from sport that if you talk to them, you will find pearls that you can take and apply in your own little way. There's many things in our profession we cannot control, but what we can control is how we react to those things when they happen, and how bad things happen to good people, and when they do happen in the operating room, to be prepared and to have envisioned what you're going to do when they happen, I think has been very helpful over the past few decades.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure.